I hesitate to tell the story of the 2015 election, as it is simply too near and currently too political in nature. But I feel that if the story is not told in its pure form, then it might also be lost. Much of the story of Stephen Harper has reflected upon the stories of weak-willed Liberal leaders. Harper was merely a person things were happening to, and rarely was he on the defensive. I think there are many stories to tell during Harper's 4 years of majority leadership. Instead, we will focus in on the stories that affected the election. Jack Layton stood with his 100-strong MPs and celebrated at the largest victory the NDP had ever known. He was bringing along the largest class of newbies to Parliament. As great of a moment for him this was, the media wasn't too happy. Stories were coming out every day about how Canada had chosen to elect so many inept MPs. One MP was on vacation in Las Vegas and didn't even vote. Hadn't even gone to the riding she was representing. One MP had not paid taxes for several years. And then there was the MP who was pregnant, single mother with 2 kids. After a year, she had not shown up to work and was still on the payroll. The NDP opted to kick her out of the caucus, and she would go on to join the Bloc Québécois. The party was devoid of talented politicians and instead had a lot of amateurs. The party was able to recruit a handful of new people to the party, but they had to work with what they had. Their biggest star was Jack Layton, and he was the guy rallying the support of the party. Within the first year of Parliament, he was beginning to look thinner and sickly. And then, suddenly, he came out and reported he had cancer. He stepped down as NDP leader, and a month later, he died. He gave his final words in a letter to NDP members and supporters. My friends, love is better than anger. Hope is better than fear. Optimism is better than despair. So let us be loving, hopeful, and optimistic, and we'll change the world. With that message, they went directly into a leadership race. Only 2 people came forward to take the leadership, Tom Mulcair and Brian Topp. Brian Topp would go on to become the director of the party's operations in Alberta. Tom Mulcair became leader. Tom Mulcair was really different from Layton. While Layton was all about positive feelings and happiness, Mulcair was about negative feelings and anger. He earned the name Mulcair the Bear for his aggressive and ruthless comments in question period. While Layton offered something different from the standard Politico, Mulcair was going to rally the anti-Harper sentiment of the nation in a fit of anger. A year after the election, he would denounce Donald Trump for spurring so much anger and violence. But during the election, one of Mulcair's supporters charged the stage of Stephen Harper and attempted to assault him. Mulcair's anger would bring the party to the highest approval rating it had ever known. At its peak, it hit 40%, and it was looking more and more like the NDP were going to form the government in the next election. Mulcair and his band of misfits took every opportunity to step in on protests and speak loudly about every single bill that hit Parliament. This meant that the NDP had to become the principled anti-conservative party and was trying to create a far-reaching coalition of voters and supporters. What they lacked through was candidates. The stigma of the NDP was still strong and prominent. Politicians and leaders were avoiding the party. Instead, Mulcair hoped to build base support with a national brand that would ultimately not matter who won the local riding organizations. If it did not matter in Quebec, it would not matter in the rest of Canada. Mulcair's defining moment was when he was the only party opposing Bill C-51.
And would start by repealing C-51.
Bill C-51 was an anti-terror bill that sought to break the barriers between CSIS and the RCMP. The new legislation would allow for a new layer of powers between the organizations that would allow them to share information, but also allow CSIS agents to detain suspects of terrorism. Small protests were happening across the country to stop the bill. However, few people were educated about it and began making ridiculous claims.
Cops are drinking. Why do they get to drive? They carry a gun. Why do they get to drive? They can do drugs and drive.
I don't know of any cops, but let me ask, what does this have to do with Bill C-51?
Oh, just making more statements.
Many gave the bill more power than it actually had. One common claim that the NDP jumped on was that it would allow for the arrest of Aboriginals and environmentalists just for protesting. His next big position was against the Senate. Mulcair was calling for the complete abolition of the Senate and had bellowed, "I have never seen a senator work a day in their life."
There are a couple of times that my assistant put in for a breakfast when I was on a plane, and they say I should have not claimed because I should have eaten that breakfast. Well, those breakfasts are pretty awful. If you want ice cold camembert with broken crackers, have it.
The lower chamber had been involved in a major scandal, which will be spoken about in greater detail later on. For now, it's important to note that Mulcair was the only politician actually suggesting that the House should no longer exist, and his stance had attracted many right-wing libertarians to the party. Finally, there was the one policy of Mulcair's that wasn't that popular: opposition to the war against ISIL. The whole world hated these guys, and constant media image just showed how cruel and barbaric they were. This stance would not allow him to pick up Canada's progressive vote, but would lose him a lot of support from the unprecedented pro-war majority. Mulcair wasn't exactly all that clean either. Mulcair was trying to use anything he could to win the upcoming election. In an early attempt at sending NDP material came when people started receiving random Tom Mulcair leaflets in the mail. These mailers are paid by taxpayers and are supposed to be sent out to constituents to ask them for input or to update them on what's going on in Parliament. But no one used them in this manner. Usually they came as polls that secretly acted as advertising materials. Mulcair stepped over the line, though, and had his offices mail them out across the country and bill them to the taxpayer. Although the practice was strained before, this was illegal and had used over $2 million in funds for mailers. The next big scandal in
The federal NDP have been caught up in an awkward situation. They've been accused of misusing parliamentary resources, and on top of the more than $1 million the party has been ordered to repay, today they were told they owe even more. As Vashi Kapelos reports, the NDP are calling it all a witch hunt.
Involved office spaces. An MP in Montreal maintained an office in Saskatoon. At no point did this MP use this office in Saskatoon. Instead, this office was fully staffed with election campaign staff for the upcoming election, and they were billing it to the taxpayer for $2.7 million. A committee dictated that all money would have to be paid back in full, or the paychecks of the MPs will be garnished until it was paid back in full, which at $170,000 a year would mean working for free for a very long time. Mulcair declared the committee was unfair and has been actively fighting it in court since. Mulcair caught a break a few months before the election. Alberta was having a provincial election. Jim Prentice had left the Conservative Party to join the PC Party as Premier. Brian Jean had left the Conservative Party to join the Wild Rose Party as leader. It was presented as a choice between two Conservative leaders. Albertans were sick of the PCs who had ruled Alberta for almost 3 decades, and an alternative in Brian Jean was needed. But in a surprise turn of events, Rachel Notley's NDP had randomly gained momentum in the polls and was elected in a miracle similar to the federal 2011 opposition win. The NDP began pushing a lot of resources into Alberta NDP to make sure the government succeeded. It seemed their fate would be tied to the success or failure of the Alberta NDP. When the writ was dropped, Mulcair had presented himself as a real choice for national leader, and many thought that in 2 months they would be addressing him as Prime Minister Tom Mulcair. If anything could be said about the Liberals between 2011 and 2015, it was gaffe after gaffe after gaffe. The Liberals had lost the election so badly that their leader, Michael Ignatieff, had lost his own seat. Bob Rae asked Ignatieff to stay on as party leader. The Liberal Party charter would require a conference within 6 months to find a new leader, but Rae looked at the party and didn't think they had enough membership to even be able to elect a leader. Bob Rae was going to try and rebuild the party from the ground up. He would become interim leader, while Michael Ignatieff technically was still party leader. Bob Rae was looking to find quality candidates across the country to sign up for the Liberal Party and run in the next election. His first pick was Chrystia Freeland, who was a reporter for Financial Times, Washington Post, The Economist, and the Globe and Mail. She appeared many times on Real Time with Bill Maher, as well as Imus in the Morning and the Colbert Report. When Bob Rae finally stepped down, she was given his very safe seat. Before he did, he got a lot of people into the party. Catherine McKenna was a former Third World lawyer turned UN negotiator responsible for a couple of treaties. Jody Wilson-Raybould was a former Indian chief and daughter of an Indian chief turned lawyer, and also she was a judge.
I have 2 children in Vancouver Island, both of whom, for some misguided reason, say they want to be a lawyer. Both of whom want to be the Prime Minister. Both of whom, Mr. Prime Minister, are women.
Bill Morneau did a lot of work on Bay Street before ascending in the ranks of the Ontario Liberal Party. Amarjeet Sohi was a councillor in Edmonton City Council. Hunter Tutu was a Northern Indian chief. Harjit Sajjan was a former Special Forces turned RCMP undercover cop. This was a real superstar team in which every person would be able to win their seat. It was a real chance at forming the official opposition again, and then someday, perhaps, becoming the government again. When it came time for the leadership convention, a lot of these candidates were talking to the media about policy of interest. But their main concern was getting in one man, Justin Trudeau. Trudeau was running against former astronaut Marc Garneau, but really it was a one-sided contest. Trudeau took the leadership with shining colors. Bob Rae immediately stepped down and resigned his seat. Since taking leadership, Trudeau was a disaster and losing supporters left and right. The first major loss happened when he attempted to parachute Harjit Sajjan into a riding. Sajjan's father was the leader of the World Sikh Organization. The WSO had a goal of having a Punjabi homeland of Khalistan. The WSO praised several terror attacks by Punjabi terrorists, including 2 against Jules Dessange, a former NDP Premier British Columbia, and a former federal Liberal minister. The process became embarrassing for Trudeau.
That commitment. And yet we have this revolt, in a manner of speaking. Thousands of Sikh British Columbians who say they're going to tear up their Liberal memberships and that the open nominations have been a sham.
When the public was promising open and free nominations for people running for the Liberal Party, but was seeing record numbers of accusations of fixing the races. Not too long after taking leadership, one of his MPs was responsible for sexually assaulting a young NDP MP.
I have learned a lot about myself in the past few months, and particularly how my jovial Newfoundland friendliness can be perceived.
Mulcair asked that it was all handled quietly and internally, but Trudeau went before the media and reported it to everyone. The controversy made both him and Mulcair look bad. Mulcair for not involving the RCMP, and Trudeau for trying to shame the victim. It was a really dirty chapter in politics that people would sooner forget. In 2014, when the Ukrainian Revolution had come to an end and the new Ukrainian government had come into power, Trudeau on French TV joked about how the Russians might be mad because they lost a hockey game and how we should instead impose sanctions against Ukraine. Shortly after, Russia began mobilizing against Ukraine and had annexed Crimea. Russia began supplying heavy weapons to rebels in Ukraine and prolonged the conflict indefinitely. Thankfully for Trudeau, people would forget this blunder over one more relevant.
Say that I regret my comments about Russia, which made light of some very real fears and concerns that Ukrainians have about Russian intervention.
Later that year, he would say,
Commitment needs to be a commitment to grow the economy, and the budget will balance itself.
Which is simply shortened down to,
budgets balance themselves.
Of course, the statement is ridiculous. Balanced budgets come when spending is equal to revenues. It doesn't happen magically, but happens as part of a plan. This would hurt him later when he ditched balanced budgets as a policy objective and began promising lewd amounts of spending.
Actually, friends, let's be fair. Justin is now changing his tune. He now says today he will run a deficit, a modest deficit. I guess it turns out the budget doesn't balance itself after all. But he'll run he says, a modest deficit, a tiny deficit, so small you can hardly see the deficit. That's what he says. A modest deficit, and only for 3 years. Only for 3 deficits. Three modest little deficits. And maybe $10 billion each. Modest $10 billion deficits.
Justin Trudeau was also regarded as being unfavorably friendly towards radical Islam. In 2011, he apologized for referring to sacrificial beheadings as barbaric. He was unwilling to call anything at all barbaric and lived in a world of cultural relativism. At the same time, he also retracted his pro-homeopathy stance. During the Charlie Hebdo bombing, Justin Trudeau said that we need to take time to understand.
We have to look at the root causes. Now, we don't know now whether it was terrorism or a single crazy or a domestic issue or a foreign issue. I mean, all those are questions. But there is no question that this happened because there is someone who feels completely excluded, completely at war with innocence, at war with a society.
It was the wrong message for the wrong time, when the world was uniting against terror. The final issue that would break him was with C-51. While the NDP fought against this bill, the Liberals voted in favor of it, claiming they would fix it later. They never did. When asked as to why we voted for it, he said he simply didn't want the Conservatives to use it against him in the campaign. He was more worried about the optics than the results. Leading into the election, Trudeau would first vote for the mission in Iraq and then vote against the mission in Iraq. He would vote in favor of F-35 jet fighters and then vote against F-35 jet fighters. He would vote against homeopathic labels and then vote for homeopathic labels. It was becoming more and more clear that Justin Trudeau was putting on an act. But would Canadians fall for it?
The Conservatives suggested in his comments about Alberta have, in some ways, shown that you haven't got the ability to unite the country. And I'm wondering if you can respond to that in both official languages.
Order.
Level of admiration I actually have for China. Mr. Speaker, benefiting every single family isn't what is fair.
If Justin was building his character, Harper had one that was built up by this point. He had transformed from the anti-government, Senate-hating outsider to everything he hated. As Jack Layton once asked of Harper, what happened? Harper had scored the coveted majority government he had been seeking for all time. While he had finally convinced enough Canadians to support him, the remainder were in war mode. On the first day of the new Parliament, a young page by the name of Bridget DePape stood before Parliament holding up a stop sign reading, "Stop Harper." DePape would be fired for violating her sacred duty of remaining neutral as a page, but would spawn the Stop Harper movement. Similarly, the science community immediately began to marshal resistance against Harper. For a matter of history, the muzzling, as it is commonly called, of federal scientists began in 2006. It was part of a new media strategy in which scientists would have to get approval before going before the media. One woman told the public that an artifact would be available in a museum, but this was false information. The muzzling of the scientists came as recommendations of previous government policy advertisers came forward with media relations strategies. In fact, all parties voted in favor of the motion, but years later pretended like it was Harper. Scientists began quitting their jobs to sign up for groups to protest Harper.
The silence was really deafening the last couple of years in the employment of the federal government. There was a certain hollow ring to the hallways as we went to work, and we continued to publish. We had lots of work.
There was a branding to portray all previous years of Harper as years of darkness. There would be themes that would carry on into what would essentially become the longest electoral campaign in Canadian history. Every single day of Harper's majority government, there were protests and statements, all driving a consistent message. Harper was a bad man. Despite what would amount to a 4-year-long protest, Harper did have some high points. Both a high point and a low point was when the Parliament Hill was attacked by a terrorist. An unarmed guard at the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier was killed in the attack. The Master-at-Arms took the terrorist out. While this was going on, Harper was stuffed in a closet while his RCMP and military-trained ministers began fashioning flags as weapons. If the terrorist was going to get Harper, it was going to have to be through a large number of loyal men. The internet became loaded with vitriol about this, accusing Harper of being a coward after being forced into a closet. Nathan Cullen, in an unprecedented move, penned a letter addressed to the public to stop the shaming, that the Prime Minister neither had a choice as to whether to be in a closet, nor was there any sense in the leader of a country putting himself at risk. If the United States had this attack, the President was brought to a secure location, no one would question it. But Harper? They had nothing but hate for Harper. This act in Parliament, however, was enough to push the Anti-Terrorism Bill C-51 through Parliament with popular consent. A few months later, terrorists in Toronto would be caught before they were able to successfully pull off an attack, and all parties would be sentenced to deportation to Pakistan.
Now, Conservatives were so concerned about privacy and freedoms that they cancelled the long-form census because it was such an intrusion on the privacy and rights of Canadians, yet are now embedding in this bill, C-51, the right of the state to have warrantless seizure and search powers without any oversight from a judge.
Harper shined in the world on the Ukraine-Russia conflict. Harper was the first one to sign embargoes against Russia, sent special forces into Ukraine to train local forces, and led the removal of Russia from the G8. When speaking with Putin, he said, "I'll shake your hand, but get out of Crimea." A year later, things would get bad in Syria. A group called the Islamic State in Syria and Levant, or ISIL for short, would invade Iraq and steal from them American weapons depot. The new organization was expanding deep into Iraq, and now Iraq was calling for help from anyone who would answer their call. America, of course, was the first to arrive on the scene, but surprisingly, France also joined the fight. Sentiments in France had now moved in favor of intervention in the region. With these two powers in the fight, having Canada on board was the icing on the cake. Once Canada joined in on the fight, it seemed like everyone would throw in to fight ISIS.
As many as 300 militants attacked 3 separate sites in a coordinated ambush Wednesday afternoon. They fired on Kurdish forces and Canadians training them with machine guns, truck bombs, and suicide attacks. The fight continued for 17 hours, but eventually the ISIS militants were pushed back, assisted by coalition airstrikes, which included Canada's CF-18s.
A real coalition had formed to take on the Islamic terrorism's main sponsor. Canada sent its bombers, who flew in 2,100 sorties in a year. France even opened up a war in Mali, in which Canada provided logistics support. This was Harper's high time. Canadians hated ISIL with passion, and all people were in favor of the war. Every time the opposition would try and talk badly about our efforts, there would be this discovery of a massacre or some barbaric practice or of progress being made on a front. Harper declared that a genocide was on and began immediately trying to get as many Christian refugees out of Syria as possible.
We will also contribute one air-to-air refueling aircraft, to Aurora surveillance aircraft, and the necessary air crews and support personnel. In addition, we are extending the deployment in a non-combat role of the up to 69 members of the Canadian Army advising and assisting security forces in Iraq. There will, however, be no ground combat mission, which is explicitly ruled out in the resolution.
When these towns were finally liberated, soldiers found mass graves everywhere. The United States and the United Nations both joined Canada in declaring this a genocide in 2016. However, Canada at that point had withdrawn its claim of genocide and never reinstated it. Harper's numbers were flying high, not as high as Mulcair's, but it did seem more than plausible that Harper could score another minority government and stay in power. And then things got bad. The Senate expense scandal found that celebrity senators Mike Duffy and Pamela Wallin had inappropriately claimed housing expenses. Duffy claimed residences in PEI from cabin with no heat or power. As well, Patrick Brazo was the token Aboriginal appointment who had become abusive to women, abused alcohol, and eventually worked as a bouncer at a nightclub. The scandal rose when Duffy agreed to pay back his expenses. But when the amount rose to $90,000, he was unable to pay that amount. Nigel Wright gave Duffy a $90,000 check. Wright was more or less a good guy. He was a millionaire who was working in government to pad his already impressive resume. When it was discovered that he gave the money to Duffy, he immediately retired and took up a position in private sector. This raised more questions than answers. It mostly ended up being nothing, but the unanswered questions inspired imaginations. And then it got worse. The Saudi government had decided to turn on the taps and let the oil flow. The global price of oil crashes and businesses were closing down left and right. Large oil corporations like Imperial Oil, Baker Hughes, Suncor were closing down production, and it was hitting the country hard. Although it wasn't hitting the country as hard as the opposition hoped it would. The Canadian dollar fell, which led to increased total sales across the country. Despite having lower production, things were very stable. There were a few months of consistent losses, followed by a few months of consistent growth. The opposition were calling it a recession, but economists weren't willing to go that far yet. In the long term, it was just stagnation, a blip in the radar. However, it would have an effect on how people would posture from here. The first news is always the only news. If it was a recession, it would require action, meaning more spending to stimulate the economy. If it was simply stagnation, it would require weathering through it. Harper was taking the stand of weathering through it, not making radical changes. Trudeau was planning to spend his way out of what he now knows is not a recession. And Mulcair was somewhere in between. August 2015 was official time period for dropping an election writ by Harper's 4-year mandate law. Harper really wanted a majority, but with his polling numbers, he couldn't possibly make it happen. He set a 2-month election to give voters more time to make up their minds in hopes that economic recovery would help them change their minds. It also gave everyone else a time to build their case. But that's for next time.